Hey, hello guys. I pray that you guys are doing well and that you are having a very blessed Apostles' Fast. As you know, in our hymns class on Friday, we are now touching on the Coptic language and not just looking at the Coptic language in terms of thinking about it in the abstract, what it is, and not even just how to read it, but how to understand it grammatically, with the goal being to look at texts in the liturgy and the New Testament and be able to make sense of them, noting significance in perhaps, for example, differences that we notice in the translation. But this will be the first video that covers a long series in the Coptic language. And I wanted to make the first video about the Coptic language, but specifically about the history of the Coptic language. Because for many who might attend the Boston church, this might not be their first rodeo or their first encounter with Coptic. For others, it might be something that they've seen, they've understood. Perhaps you can even read it, but you're looking to understand it grammatically and you're looking to become more quote unquote fluent in it. So, regardless, I think the goal is to have a deep understanding of the language and move beyond just mere exposure. So, before we get into anything, what is Coptic? For many who attend a liturgy in the Coptic Orthodox Church, most liturgies, you'll hear many of the hymns and many of the melodies and many of the words in the language and the text of the liturgy in a language that is Coptic. Sometimes it'll be English, sometimes it will be in Arabic. But many times you'll hear a hymn, especially a hymn, in the Coptic language. And so we kind of ask ourselves, okay, I get that this seems to be a liturgical language, right, in our church, but what really is it? Where does it come from? Where did we get this language from, right? Because for us, it might just seem like it's our analog or our equivalent of Greek from the Greek Orthodox Church, or Latin, for example, within the Catholic Church, or any liturgical language in any church for that matter, right? But there is a deeper history to Coptic, and it was not just this liturgical language invented on the spot. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Coptic language. And then after the history, we're going to get into how to read Coptic, the lettering, and where those letters come from. But that will be the second part of this video. Okay. So let's begin with the history of the Coptic language. Okay. The Coptic language was developed in Egypt, as you are most likely aware of. But it didn't get developed in Egypt out of nowhere. It's actually the product of a very long series of transitions in the Egyptian language. And the Egyptian language itself was not static by any means. When we study the Egyptian language historically, we separate it into two broad categories. Okay, we have what is known as earlier Egyptian. Okay, earlier Egyptian, and then we have later Egyptian. So we have earlier Egyptian and later Egyptian. And when I say Egyptian, I'm talking about Arabic. I'm talking about Egyptian as in when you think about the hieroglyphs, right? Earlier Egyptian covers a time span as this language from 3000 BC to about 1300 BC. And later Egyptian from 1300 BC till right now, actually. In much the same way that if you studied English, right, we have Old English, right, we have medieval English, we have maybe classical English, Old English, all that, and then we have our modern English, right? So if you were to take a look at English as it was written in, let's say, for example, the 1400s, very different from the way that English might be written now when you look at a New York Times article, right? Something that you see in any language for that matter is development, is change, okay? Now, earlier Egyptian itself is also not static. It's not like from 3000 BC to 1300 BC the language of Egyptian was the same. There's actually two categories within earlier Egyptian that we also have to look at. There is what we know as Old Egyptian, and we also have Middle or Classical Egyptian. Forgive my handwriting. Old Egyptian covers about 3000 BC to 2000 BC. Okay. And Middle Egyptian from about 2000 BC to 1300 BC. What's significant about Old Egyptian versus Middle/Classical Egyptian? Well, Old Egyptian from 3000 BC to 2000 BC is Egyptian that really arose and dominated as a time at a time known as the time of the pyramids, right? And many religious texts at the time and many texts at the time written in Old Egyptian are known as the pyramid texts. Why? Because Old Egyptian was not this very common Egyptian, right? It was not like the English we know today that is used by everybody and written by everybody. Old Egyptian was a form of writing, was a language that was used in pyramids, which, as you know, held very symbolic and religious, social, and politically significant positions within Egyptian society, especially as it related to burying, right, uh, and setting up the tombs of the administrative elite and the royalty of Egypt. So Old Egyptian from 3000 to 2000 BC was this language that was largely relegated to the administrative elite and the royalty. It was not this common language, right? When we move to Middle and Classical Egyptian, now we begin to see a bit of a difference. Again, it's largely an elitist language, right? It's still largely used by the elite, by the educated, those who are connected now to the administrative elite and the royalty. But at the same time, you're seeing it's going beyond just pyramids and tombs, right? It's not just used for this kind of like obituary purpose that was being used in the pyramids. Now it's being used for Egyptian literature. So wisdom texts, right? Fictional tales of heroes, poetic texts, praises and hymns for Egyptian gods and kings were written in Middle and Classical Egyptian. But again, Middle and Classical Egyptian is coming from Old Egyptian that is now being made more common. That takes us up to this point right here, 1300 BC, which is where we see late Egyptian. Again, late Egyptian continues this trend of being used for wisdom texts, poems, and literary tales, right? And it's still borrowing a lot from Middle and Classical Egyptian, but it's changing a little bit, right? It might be changing a little bit grammatically in terms of the hieroglyphs, in terms of what those texts look like. And forgive me, I don't have many visuals. I don't know how to write hieroglyphs, but you can kind of assume that as we're going from earlier to late Egyptian, and this is the way it kind of happens, is that we're moving more from these very graphic, big picture hieroglyphs to something that looks a little bit more like the text that we see nowadays in Coptic or English or Spanish, for example, that type of script that isn't necessarily as graphical. Okay. So later Egyptian, I should say, is also split up into its three categories. And this is where I want to also distinguish it. Okay. We have in later Egyptian, late Egyptian, there's a difference between these two, right? Late Egyptian is a specific time period that covers from about 1300 BC to 700 BC. Okay. Coming from late Egyptian, we move into what is known as Demotic Egyptian, or just Demotic. And that covers a pretty long time span from 700 BC to 400 AD. Okay. And then last but not least, we have our beloved Coptic that really becomes a thing starting around 100 AD till now. Okay. So again, late Egyptian from 1300 BC to 700 BC is largely used for things like wisdom texts, poems, and literary tales. Demotic Egyptian, however, right, is where we actually see a very big shift. And why do we see a very big shift? We see a very big shift because as we go from late Egyptian to Demotic Egyptian, we see something that grammatically is the same as late Egyptian. right? The thing that's actually preserved the most in the Coptic language as it relates to older Egyptian is the grammar, right? So Demotic Egyptian is grammatically very similar to late Egyptian, okay? However, orthographically, and that seems like a big word, but orthographically, that means in terms of how it looks like, right? Demotic is quite different. It has less hieroglyphs and less graphic characters. So something you might be used to seeing in the hieroglyphs is like an image of an eagle, right? An image of a man, all of these things. This is becoming less and less of a case over time. And as we read Demotic, or as we reach Demotic Egyptian, as we begin to read it, it looks a lot more like usual kind of English Coptic Greek script. Okay. It does not have that same type of graphical character to it. But again, this Egyptian, Demotic even, is largely found in the use of literature and administration. So it's not even that common aslan. It's not that commonly used, right? Coptic is a little bit interesting, right? Because as you see, Demotic Egyptian goes from 700 BC to 400 AD. It's kind of largely extinct by 400 AD. But Coptic begins to develop around 100 AD, almost independently. And where is it developing from, you might ask, right? Well, a small part of it is coming from Demotic Egyptian and the earlier stages of the Egyptian language, right? But Coptic is becoming a thing that's developed independently through temple priests, right? It borrows grammatically from Demotic and late Egyptian, right? And some characters being taken from the Greek alphabet, and some being demotic characters, right, taken from demotic Egyptian, right? But you're noticing Coptic is now being used in two contexts, right? The first being for pagan rituals, actually, in things like amulets, right? In small little trinkets and quote unquote idols, right? That were coming out of pagan rituals. That's actually where you're seeing some of the Coptic being used. So Coptic was not an inherently Christian language, right? And that Coptic that was used in things like amulets and Coptic that was used in pagan rituals looks a little bit different from the, actually looks a lot different from the Coptic that we use nowadays. The Coptic that we use nowadays was much more Hellenistic, much more Greek in nature. And that's where we get a lot of the Greek loanwords, right? If you notice, a lot of the Greek loanwords we have are loanwords that apply to theological concepts, right? So theos, for example, is not a Coptic word, it's a Greek word meaning God, right? But words like that, theotokos, likewise, right? So you're seeing a lot of Greek words being borrowed and implemented into Coptic. And it's in many ways taken and claimed by Christian writers. So much so that by the second century, in the school of Alexandria, you have translations of the New Testament, or many New Testament texts, I should say, because New Testament's not officially canonized yet, so to speak. But many New Testament texts, right? Many patristic texts going from Greek into Coptic. Okay. Now, the overall pattern we're noticing is that we're going from something that's a lot less hieroglyphic, a lot less graphic, right? Something far less visual into something that's a little bit more subtle, right? But the grammatical similarities across all of this, right, from earlier Egyptian to later Egyptian to Coptic, are all actually quite similar, okay? So why is this important to know? Like, why do I care about Coptic and its development and the history of it? Like, just teach me how to read so I can say the hymns and say the doxologies and read stuff in Coptic. The reason it's important to understand is because even when we talk about this time period, 100 AD till now, there's a lot of misconceptions about Coptic. When you go to liturgy or you go to Tasbih or you go to Vespers or you even open up Coptic Reader and you look at the New Testament or anything in Coptic, there's this feeling like this is an ancient language. And this is a language that has existed before Christ and at the time of Moses, and that like Chenoshot was being sung, as in Coptic, right, was being sung as the Red Sea was parted, right? Coptic is indeed a very old language with very old roots, but even in the Coptic that developed around the first century, it's important to understand that there are many differences, right? What we see nowadays is New Bohairic Coptic. When you open up Coptic Reader, that is New Bohairic Coptic. So there is Bohairic Coptic that is older. It sounds quite different in its pronunciation, and some texts will actually be different in Bohairic Coptic. There's also the Coptic that you might have known from, let's say, for example, Saint Shenouda, the Archimandrite, who wrote in Sahidic Coptic. It's a different Coptic, actually, than what you see nowadays, right? So Coptic changed a lot even over the course of this time from 100 AD till now. And it's important to note that when we talk about it being ancient, that doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's necessarily as ancient as we think. And number two, that doesn't mean it was unchanged, right? It is a dynamic language. I mean, if we just look at English, for example, in the past 2 decades, we have many new terms and many new expressions that have been popularized or even just didn't exist before. So it's the same thing with Coptic, right? Over the course of 2000 years since its, onset, it would be crazy to say that Coptic is the same as it was at the time of Saint Mark the Apostle versus Coptic as it is nowadays in Coptic Reader, right? So understanding that is also very, very crucial, right? So why is this also additionally important? Because I think it's also important to understand that there is indeed a value to the Coptic language, right? There is indeed a value to understanding the Coptic language, and that because it is so close to the original Greek, looking at original texts, original manuscripts in Coptic can be very revealing and very helpful, right? A big difficulty in translation is this kind of telephone game, is this lost in translation, right? Where you read a text and it's originally written in Greek, for example, right? And then it's passed down into, let's say, Syriac or Coptic, right? Perhaps even Arabic. And then it gets translated into English. And you're going through multiple rounds of translation, right? Perhaps different editors, different authors, different writers, all of this. And you ask yourself, is what I'm reading close to the original translation? Or is it the intended translation, the intended meaning? Right? And not that we shouldn't, believe that what we're reading is true or cast doubt on everything. Not that at all, but rather more to say that understanding an older language is always helpful in understanding older texts. And because many of our hymns and many of our texts are fairly old, understanding an older language has incredible value, especially in terms of preserving the original meanings, preserving the original texts. And that's a big part of learning hymns, aslan. It's not just about being able to go to tasbih and sing a hymn, or going to liturgy and singing a hymn, or knowing what to do when the microphone is in front of you. That's not what hymnology and learning Coptic is all about. It's about an element of preservation, right? The earliest consecrated ma'allims were not consecrated just for the sake of having a ma'allim at a church who knew the hymn when nobody else didn't, right? The purpose of the first consecrated ma'allims was to preserve hymnology. There was a lack of standardization, there was a lack of organization, there was a fear that certain hymns were going to go extinct. And unfortunately, there are many hymns that have gone extinct, right? So the overall purpose of all of this is preservation and teaching, so that we, being disciples, can eventually grow older and teach future generations who can be our disciples and benefit from the same discipleship that we did. Okay? But this is just a very basic history, very, very basic, very fundamental, very unexpansive history of the Egyptian language. And I wanted to include this that way when we're looking at Coptic and studying the words and studying the grammar, we have a bit of an understanding of where particular things are coming from, right? When you see a lot of Greek words, don't worry, mish heresy, and it's not like the Greeks are invading the Coptic church. It's just the reality of the fact that Coptic was developed at a time when Greek was the dominant liturgical and dominant language for many texts within our church. Okay? But I love you guys so, 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 so much. I pray that you found this video helpful or fruitful in any way, shape, or form. And in the next video, we will begin to look at the letters of the Coptic alphabet, followed by some basic vocab and nouns. But I pray you guys found this video helpful in any way, shape, and form. And I pray you have a blessed Apostles' Fast. And if you need anything, please, please, please let me know.